Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Pinchas, and in this parsha we have something very important. It's the beginning of a transition of power from Moshe to Yeshua, from Moses to Joshua. Moshe, of course, was a prophet, a legislator, a military commander, a miracle performer. He was everything and anything to the Jewish people. There's a transition now where we're going to go as the Jews enter the land of Israel, which doesn't happen till the end of Devarim, of course. But when they enter the land of Israel, what happens is now we're going to have more of a division of power. And Yeshua is a prophet. He speaks to God. But more importantly, he's a military and political leader. But of course, he also has to have the Ruach Hashem, the Spirit of God, within him to make sure that political and military leader does not go off the rails, as it often does and often has within Jewish history. But I think it's important to understand why there's a transition of power. So the Torah tells us in this week's parsha, as it tells us numerous times, that the reason Moshe and Aaron were not able to go into the land of Israel is because, as we had in the other parsha, Moshe didn't hit the rock. He hit the rock, instead of speaking to the rock. And he wasn't Mekadesh Shem Shemayim. He didn't sanctify the name of God. But in the scheme of things, it seems to be something very minor. Again, we could talk about this on many different levels, why the sin was great or why it was that specific sin was something which would not allow him to, for him to, and Aaron to enter the land of Israel. But I think there's something else going on. And the way I'd explain it is that, yes, he did sin, and therefore he did not sanctify God's name, but it's almost as it's an excuse. There's a medrash that my father used to often quote, which says that when we have Moshe, it says, V'eschan el Hashem, later on in Devarim, Moshe pleads with God that he should go into the land of Israel. It seems to say that Moshe was saying, listen, my whole life was devoted to taking the Jewish people out of Egypt, establishing the Jewish nation, receiving the Torah, and going to the land of Israel, which would be the fulfillment of the promise. And that's everything I stood for, everything I hoped for, and everything I dreamed for. Let me go in. And God says no. So the Medrash says, let me go in as just on a lower level. I won't be the leader. I'll just be from the Hamonam, from the masses. God says no. Let me go in, he says, as almost an animal. And God says no, as a bird. And it goes on and on to say how many different levels Moshe is struggling to say, I just want to go in. It doesn't matter if I'm in a position of power anymore. And God says no. So either it's because the sin was so great, but I think it's very simple. What it's trying to say is that sometimes leadership has to pass from one generation to another. The sin of the hitting of the rock might be significant in the sense that, as I've said other times, he was hitting the rock and performing miracles rather than speaking to the rock, which is a form of tefillah or prayer. And he didn't understand necessarily the transition that the Jewish people had to go through, that when they enter the land of Israel, it's no longer God and the prophets just being miracle workers, but rather the people have to work on their own. And although Moshe could have been explained this, and he might have even explained it himself, there's a certain association which Moshe had with leadership, and also the Jewish people did. And it's saying that the break, and this medrash is maybe exaggerating it, but it's saying on all levels we have to have a new start. We have to have a fresh start. Every generation needs a different leader. And sometimes you see that in life, modern life, that leaders might be very great in their leadership ability, but after a while they're no longer relevant to the new generation. They're used to things as they were done in the past. They don't know how to look at it differently. The people look at them in a different way, and sometimes they need fresh blood. There's a very famous medrash, because it says in the Torah later on, you should go to Hashofet Ashayeh B'Yom Mehem. You go to the judge, which is in your generation, in that generation. And the Gemara tells us, Yiftach B'Doro K'Shmuel B'Doro, that in every generation you go to the judge who's there. You don't say, well, you're not as great as the one before. Yiftach is a very minor leader in the Jewish people in the book of Shoftim. Shmuel is one of the greatest prophets the Jewish people ever had. And the Medrash is saying, listen, Shmuel's no longer here at a certain point. you have to listen to Yiftach, even though he's a lower level. He might not be so good. He might be flawed in many different ways. You have to accept the leadership that you have. And again, the leadership that you have is not only, well, too bad it's the generations are now diminished and we only have a Yiftach. It's saying that every generation needs the leader which is appropriate for that generation. And you have to be able to accept that leadership. You have to look to that leadership, and you have to understand that sometimes there's a new approach. And that's really the message here with Moshe and Aaron. It's time to go to Yoshua. And it's really said very simply when Moshe says, when he's told that he will die, he says to God, he says, please, Hashem Elokei Haruchos, God, who's the God of all spirits, please make sure that there's a leader for the Jewish people. They shouldn't be without a roa, without a shepherd, without a leader. And he uses the phrase Elohei Haruchos, the God of the spirits. And afterwards God responds and he says, yes, take Yehoshua Asher Ruach Bo, whose spirit, the spirit is in him. But it's not just the spirit, I think, of God, but it's Elohei Haruchos. It's the spirit, it's the God of the spirits in the plural. The many different spirits there in the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people have many different ideas, many different perspectives. And God, who understands the individuality of each and every person, has to make sure that there's a leader who could take those individual perspectives that make up the Jewish people and understand what leadership is for them. And therefore, we have to go to the next generation. And of course, Yeshua is very fitting because he's one of the spies that said, no, we're going to go into the land and we'll be able to conquer the land. So he has that spirit. He has the spirit of God. He's a student of Moshe, but he's still a new generation. Good Shabbos.